And tonight, as you see, we're going to go visit the island of Crete. And of all the places that I went, one place I would maybe most like to return would be Crete, particularly because of something we missed there. Maybe on another trip we could go see that. And it all has to do with Bible things, and I'll show you that as we continue on this. So let's talk about the island of Crete. There's where we were over at Cyprus on the far right hand. And we made our way over to Crete. That's the large arrow pointing down. It is the fourth largest island in the Mediterranean Sea, Cyprus being the third largest island. Crete is the largest of the Greek islands and the most southern part of the Greek islands. And look how strategically located it is in the Mediterranean Sea, right there on the border between east and west, and also with the Aegean Sea to the north and the sea to the south. When we were in Crete, they called that the Libyan Sea, talking about Africa being close at hand by that way. Now, the little arrow pointing up, the big arrow pointing down is going to Crete. The little arrow pointing up is pointing to the island of Rhodes. And we did go by that island and spent a brief time there. So I'll tell you just a little bit about Rhodes. It's mentioned one time in the scriptures. It's in Acts chapter 21 in verse 1. Paul, on his way to Jerusalem, having met with the Ephesian elders at Miletus, and it says, after we were gotten from them and had launched, we came with a straight course unto Cus, and the day following unto Rhodes, and from thence into Patara. That unto can be translated into Rhodes, indicating it wasn't just passing by, but that they came to Rhodes, came into one of their harbors, stayed there for some time, and then left, but probably just a very brief period when Paul was at Rhodes. Now, Rhodes has an interesting history. It's always been kind of an independent island, sometime associated with Asia Minor, sometime associated with Crete, but even in the midst of those associations, it's tried to maintain its independence, and it has some of that flavor yet today, even though officially it's a Greek island. And here is an embayment on the island of Rhodes that they call St. Paul's Bay, because this is one of the places, one of two places they think, well, Paul's ship may have come in. It very likely would have come into this bay, and traditionally that's the place, St. Paul's Bay. Very beautiful. And you see it's got a little narrow inlet with the sea coming on in. But look up on that mountain. Up on that mountain is another Acropolis, like they have at Athens, built to some of the gods of the Greek and Roman gods that were up there. If you see off to the left is the white buildings, the city of Lindos, a very colorful, well, it's all white. That makes it colorful, very interesting, beautiful little village of little narrow streets. You can't drive in them, but you can walk through those streets. And when you get out of Lindos and start going up to that Acropolis, you take 600 steps to get up there. And in the old days, what you did, you'd walk up those 600 steps, you would make your sacrifice, and then you would ask the priest if you could have permission to pray to one of those gods. And if the priest granted you that permission, you could go pray to that god. Aren't you glad we don't have to climb 600 steps and ask for permission when we want to pray? But that's the way that they did it in those days. That Acropolis, you might recognize that if you're an old movie fan and had ever watched The Guns of Navarone. Well, that's the cliff, and that's the area up there on top where that film was made, The Guns of Navarone. It's a make-believe film, though, and not very interesting when I watched it ahead of this trip. But I don't want to dwell on that. Talking about that Acropolis up there, it's very beautiful, and it has a Bible connection. Now, it's due to earthquakes more than anything else that these things are in ruins here at Rhodes, but it had been in ruins before. And it has a connection with Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great was great because partly he was a great politician. Herod the Great supported Pompey until he was defeated by Julius Caesar. And then he switched his allegiance to Caesar until Caesar was assassinated. And then he joined his allegiance to Mark Antony until Octavius defeated him. And then he came to Rhodes and met with Octavius and was able to manipulate and maintain his kingdom through these different Roman emperors and politicians. And when he got to Rhodes and met with Mark Antony, whom he had been against, not Mark Antony, but Octavius, whom he'd been against, Octavius was now Augustus Caesar. And part of winning his heart, he said, I'll tell you what I will do. I will finance the refurbishing of that Acropolis over at Rhodes. He was at Rhodes at the time. I'll finance that in your honor if you let me keep my kingdom. And so Augustus let him do that. And so you look at those ruins up there of what was that at Herod's time and realize that was paid for by the taxes that Herod the Great had squeezed out of the Jews over around Jerusalem and Judea. I thought that was interesting. Now you go up to the top there and you can look down on St. Paul's Bay, and this is just for fun. It's heart-shaped when you look down at it, and so we had to get a selfie in front of the heart-shaped bay. It looks like it's all enclosed, but it's not. That little gap is still there. And so we got a selfie from the top of that Acropolis, having climbed those 600 steps, and then looking down at St. Paul's Bay. But our interest tonight is not Rhodes, it is Crete. Crete has a long history, about 600 years before Christ. Homer was writing about the island of Crete. And in the Odyssey, he writes one of those great islands of the world in mid-sea. In the wide, dark sea is Crete, spacious and rich and populous with 90 cities and a mingling of tongues. I want you to remember that. 90 cities, because we'll get back to that. In the Iliad, he writes about Crete, and he says those pleasant towns, and all from that island of 100 cities. Well, that's the same. He's talking about the 90 cities. Now he's talking about 100 cities. And they supplied the Greeks with 80 black ships that crossed the sea to go wage their war against Troy. Well, there's the island of Crete. You see that Heracleon up at the top, the little island above at the north part of Crete? If that arrow would extend all the way to the north, you see that little city up there? That's where I meant to point. That is where our ship came to dock at Heracleon. That's the modern port. But Crete is interesting in that is the oldest civilization in all of Europe. You know, we talk about culture. Now, culture comes from the land, agriculture and the cultivation, and that's where culture comes from. But civilization, do you hear the word city in civilization? When people start gathering together out of their little farms and start specializing and forming communities and cities, that is civilization. The oldest city in all of Europe is at Knossos, right there beside Hierapolis. And there are some reconstructions that have been done of that ancient city, and it's got its own history there. That road off to the right is called by our guide, said that's the oldest road in all of Europe, connecting three of these ancient cities back there in Crete. Now, we're talking about back maybe 800 BC during times of these cities. But the Minoans were there. The Mycenaeans were up in the mainland of Greece. They sort of overwhelmed the Minoans. It was those Minoan cities that waged that war against Troy. and then went into these dark ages where, because of various things, there are signs of invasions, earthquakes, other natural phenomena, economic decline, and they just kind of disappeared, these civilizations, and made themselves slowly out of those dark ages into what we call modern Greece. And that is interesting that they think the real culture of ancient Greece came not from the great philosophers, but from the farmers that were trying to solve problems during those dark ages, getting together like that. But this is the oldest city in Europe. Now, we read about this in the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 10, 1 through 14, we read about Noah, Ham, Mizraim, Calcium, out of whom came Philistim, and Caphtorim. That Caphtorim is thought to be a reference to the people that settled in the island of Crete. We read about it again in 1 Chronicles 1, 4 through 12. Noah, Ham, Mizraim, Calcium, of whom came the Philistines, and Caphtorim. The Philistines, that is a sea peoples that settled over there in Israel. And as people look at where did these people come from, there's a lot of people that think they must have come from the island of Crete. And during all that upheaval in those dark ages that occurred there, and made their way over to the land of Israel looking for a new land. In Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 23, we read about the Avams which dwelt in Hazreum. That was the land of the Philistines before the Philistines were there. But even unto Azra, the Caphtorims which came forth out of Caphtor, destroyed them and dwelt in their stead. Those Caphtorims, well, they're the Philistines. In Jeremiah 47, 1 through 4, the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Philistines. In the day that cometh to spoil all the Philistines, for the Lord will spoil the Philistines, the remnant of the country of Caphtor. And then Amos chapter 9 and verse 7. Have I not brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Ker? And so that's the Old Testament connection to that island of Crete, the ancient homeland of the Philistines. But now we come to the New Testament, and we read about an individual that was from that island. And earlier, go to the day of Pentecost. Jews had settled in the island of Crete. Now, I want you to make that point, because it's going to help us explain something in the book of Titus, that there were many Jews and synagogues throughout the land of Crete, just like there had been in the land of Cyprus. And some of them were there on the day of Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2, 9 through 11, as it talks about all the places where the Jews had gathered together in Jerusalem, it mentions among them Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians. Do we hear them speak in our tongue the wonderful works of God? And it's very likely that the Church of Christ began in Crete as these Jews that were there on Pentecost made their way home and began carrying the gospel back to their homelands. Now here's where we read about Paul coming to Crete in Acts chapter 27. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and we were scarce come over against Sindus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed unto Crete over against Simone. And hardly passing by it, came to a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereinto was the city of Lasea. Now this is Paul on his voyage to Rome as a prisoner. And we can trace on the map the course of his journey, going near Rhodes again, over to Sindus, around Simone, and then going back under the island. I was reading in one of the books about this, about navigation in the ancient Mediterranean. Why didn't they go across the northern part? Why did they go across the southern part? And it's because of the currents. The currents over the northern part of Crete were going to the east. And in the southern part of the Crete, the currents would carry them to the west. So that explains why they're trying to go under the island to get their way around. And then they came over to this place called Fair Havens, and that's where the arrow was. You see that one arrow pointing down? That's the place where we docked. But we made a journey across that island to go see the place where Paul was at Fair Havens. Well, to me, it was one of the highlights of the trip. It's about, a distance from about here to Sparta, if you could go straight, but you can't go straight. You're going across the mountains and through the valleys, and we go into the interior of that island, and we crossed a great valley. They call it the Great Plain of Crete down there. This is going up the other side. But if you look off toward the left, you see on that southern island the snow-capped mountains that were there while we were there. If I have my geography right, that's Mount Ida in Crete. And so looking back over that valley, it was just beautiful. And then here's the roads we went on. You can see a big tour bus trying to navigate back up those mountains through those roads. We went through little bitty towns that the bus could hardly fit through the streets on both sides. And then their cars parked on the streets. And how that driver made those turns, I don't know. The townspeople would come out to see if the bus could make it. Little boys would run along the roof making faces at us, seeing if the bus could even get through the village. But we did. And then we went back up over that mountain on the other side. And when we topped that mountain and started back down toward the Libyan Sea, we saw Fair Havens. You see that island out there with those 3 tanks? They call that St. Paul's Island, commemorating the memory that they have or the heritage that they have that Paul had arrived at Crete in that place. And this is coming on the other way, looking at it from the other direction. You see where that arrow is pointing, and that's about where they had found the ruins of the city of Lycia that we read about in the book of Acts. So they came to the island of Crete, and they built on a little hill that overlooks that bay this chapel for St. Paul. Now, it didn't mean that Paul was ever there. They do have a little cave there, they say, where Paul stayed while he was on the island, but the Bible mentions nothing about that. But it's built as a memorial of the visit that Paul made there many, many years ago. So that when we come here, say, oh yeah, that chapel's to remind us that Paul the apostle had been here on his way to Rome. We gathered under the porch of that chapel, and I gave a devotional there that is similar to something I'm going to be talking about tonight. In Acts chapter 27, we read, now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence, also if by any means thou might attain unto Phoenicia, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lie toward the southwest and northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. The place was not commodious. Well, what does that mean? Well, evidently it wasn't a good place to winter. Could have been several things. We're talking about 270 people showing up in a little village that really wasn't prepared to receive them. It's also situated so that the winds coming from the south over that winter would buffet against those ships and make it hard to maintain them there. And also, these were big grain ships. And where were they going to unload that grain? They didn't want it staying on the ship, risking it getting wet, beginning to swell and to spoil on those ships. And they didn't really have a place to store their grain. And so for several reasons, they were thinking, this isn't going to be a good place to winter. Now, if you'll excuse me here, we were on a bus load of almost 50 people, and most of us, we had a few young people with us, but they would have called most of us seniors, okay? And so we made this long trip across. It was about an hour and a half to go that distance. And after you spend an hour and a half on a bus with 50 singers, well, you need to take a break. So when we got to Fair Havens, we were going to take a break. But there's just this one little shop there. It sold coffee, and they had their own little bathroom, and that was it. And so our John Moore was apologizing. I said, well, the scripture said it was not commodious, so we may do while we were over there at Crete taking that break. And if you ever go on one of these journeys, those breaks are very important, you know, to have a good journey. But the impetuous wind, Euroclydon. I'm going to take you back to Athens. There in Athens in the 2nd century, they opened up a new forum. The Romans called it a forum instead of an agora. And in that forum, they built this tower. Now, on the top of that tower was a weather vane blowing toward the wind, a big arrow that would point to where the wind would blow. And around the top of that tower, can you see the engravings across the top? Are the winds, names of the wind based on the direction. Here they are. One of those winds that are represented on that tower is named Euroclydon. I thought that was interesting over in Athens. That was the name of the wind that blew Paul off course and his ship off course when they were trying to sail around Crete. So Acts chapter 27. When the ship was called and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship and fearing, lest they should fall into quicksand, strike sail, and so were driven. And we were exceedingly tossed with the tempest. The next day they lightened the ship. And the 3rd day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay upon us, all hope that we should be saved was lost, was taken away. But after long absence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. Here's what happened. You see the arrow pointing to Fair Havens. And then that other arrow, way over on the left hand, is Phoenix, they call it now here. And that's where they were going to try to make where they thought would be at a better harbor, being more commodious to winter in. And it looked like the wind was in their favor. If they could just make it around that point, and then head back and hug the island of Crete. If you can see that green line, I can't tell if you can tell it's green from there or not. That was their plan. But as they got free of that point, and that's where that arrow is pointing up, just as they're rounding that point is where Euroclydon began to blow. And coming out over those mountains of Crete and swooping down across, they could not get back to the island. And so they had to strike sail and just go where the wind would carry them. And it carried them near that island there of Clauda that is way south of where they were hoping to go. Now, the biblical lesson is this. Use this as an illustration. The centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And the more part advised to depart thence also. Down in Acts 27:21, Paul said, you should have listened to me. You know, it's easy to believe the experts, isn't it? I mean, these people have vested interests. These guys have probably gone to school and studied this. These guys think that everyone believes they know what they're talking about. They're the experts, and they tell you something that's different than what the Bible says. And then you look around, and what do most people think? Well, they're all believing these experts. You go with the majority, and so you've got the master and owner of the ship, and you've got the more part, and they're advising against Paul. But Paul says, you should have listened to me. And that's what we need to do. When all the college professors and all of the experts and all the professionals and all the worldly cultural people all tell you something the Bible doesn't say, you need to listen to what the scriptures say, don't you? The Lord knows what he's talking about. And we need to listen to what Paul said. But let's go to the book of Titus. If I was going back to Crete, I'd want to make a special effort to go to Gortina. That was the Roman capital of Crete during the time that Paul and Titus were there, during that first century. This is probably the place Paul and Titus were when they came to the island of Crete after Paul had been released from Rome on that first occasion. In Titus 1 and verse 5, Paul writes, "For this cause I left thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city as I had appointed thee." There at Gortina are ancient Roman ruins that go back to the time when Rome was the capital there. But also about 300 to 400 years afterward, Christianity had taken great hold upon that island. And they built a massive church. They called those big churches the basilicas. And they built this great basilica. An earthquake took it down. But this is what remains. And it was the Basilica of Titus. In fact, where we anchored in that northern port, they have a church there. And some that didn't cross the island with us went to go see that church. And they brought them out a box and said, you know, if you open up this box, we have the skull of Titus in this box. Well, I don't know if that was the skull of Titus in that box or not. But it is reminders that there was great interest in the fact that Titus had been on that island and that the apostle had asked him to set those churches in order by appointing elders in every city. You remember why I wanted you to remember the 90 cities, the 100 cities? Crete had been known down through the centuries as the island of many cities. And in those cities, now these would be like towns we would call, but in many of those cities were synagogues because of the Jews' presence there. But also there were churches meeting in all those little towns, or most of them. And so they needed elders. To appoint elders in every city in Crete is not different than what Paul did when he was in Asia Minor and said appoint elders in every church. And so he is commissioning Titus here, empowering Titus to say, now you need to set things in order. And for the churches in Crete, for those churches to have order, they needed elders. Now, I was asked to talk about the things that every church needs. And so on another devotional I gave when I was on the island of Crete, I said we can find that from the book of Titus. And I want to mention 3 things that we learn from the book of Titus that every church needs. And every church needs order. I know you can be God's church without elders, because these churches lacked elders, but they were still churches of Christ. But they were becoming disorderly. And to establish order in those churches, Paul's remedy here was, you need to appoint elders, someone to take the reins and take responsibility and bring order to these churches. So every church needs order. And the reason they need order is because there were many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped. Those teachers were causing disorder among the churches of the island of Crete. Now, they were unruly, see, disorderly. They were vain talkers. They were saying things they just should not have said. They were deceivers in that they were not always telling the truth. And they were of the circumcision. That means that they were Jews. Remember, from the day of Pentecost, there were Jews from Crete there on the day of Pentecost. And the church in Crete consisted largely of Jews, but it was reaching out and bringing in, by this time, Gentiles into the church. And everywhere that seemed to happen, there were things that had to be overcome for that to be able to work. And these disorderly Jews were causing problems with the Gentiles coming into the church. Let me show you what happens. It says, someone was saying this: the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. And then Paul writes, this witness is true. Now, this goes back to a legend that goes long back in the island of Crete. It was told by Epimedes. Now, we're talking about 600 years before Paul came to the island of Crete. And people had referred to this down through the time where there's a mountain there in Crete that the Cretans call the grave of Zeus. But Zeus was supposed to be a god that never died. And so they're lying when they call that the grave of Zeus. And they say that's where the great Cretan lie comes from. Well, perhaps so. Perhaps Epimedes even said that. But the only record we have of Epimedes saying anything like that is from a theologian that was referring to this passage out of the book of Titus 400 years after Paul wrote this letter. He's separated by Epimedes by 1,000 years. So we've never found where Epimedes said anything like this. And so we're wondering, is that where that came from? Maybe there's something else going on here. And what is the witness that is true? Let me give you another look at this passage. It doesn't say certain of their own poets have said. The Cretes had poets, and one of them was Epimedes. But it said certain of their own prophets. Well, Epimedes is never called a prophet. But teachers in the church were called prophets. And notice what Paul's dealing with here. Unruly and vain talkers, deceivers, they of the circumcision, those whose mouths must be stopped, and one of their own selves. That's one of these of the circumcision, saying these vain, unruly things. One of their, even a prophet of their own, suggesting the prophet may not have been the poet Epimedes, but referring to what some of these of the circumcision were saying about the Gentiles that were on the island of Crete. Can you imagine trying to go to an island of Crete and you're trying to teach them the gospel? And those in the church are saying, well, those folk, they're always liars. They're evil beasts and slow bellies. Well, it's going to be hard to win them over when people have that attitude toward them, isn't it? Listen, people talking like that, somebody needs to stop their mouth. And it was the job of the elders there to put a stop to this and bring order to those churches so that the gospel would be receptive to those islanders of Crete. Well, didn't Paul say this witness is true? Yes, but what did he mean? Did he mean it's true that the Cretans are always liars? Or did it mean that one of their own prophets had said that the Cretans were always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies? And I would invite you to entertain the latter. You know, when Paul was in Ephesus. The witnesses came to him and said, there's the vision of the church at Corinth. And that witness was true. And so Paul may have been told by witnesses, you know, some of those of the uncircumcision, they're saying the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. And Paul gets there and finds out what I've heard about this is true. And we need to stop their mouths because this is causing problems and it's unruly and it's disorderly. Now, in Titus chapter 1, we read about sound doctrine. And that's something else the church needs. The church needs to be orderly, and the church needs to be taught sound doctrine. Well, what do we mean sound doctrine? We're talking about healthy teaching. That's what sound doctrine means. Not teaching hurtful things, but helpful things. Healthy things, the things of the Spirit. And here's what this is called. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 1, it's the truth which is after godliness. In Titus 1 and verse 9, it's the faithful word. Also in Titus chapter 1 and verse 9, it's called sound doctrine. In Titus 2, he said, speak thou the things that become sound doctrine. What is becoming to healthful teaching? Healthful living. And so for 2 chapters, Paul talks about healthy behavior. And he gets specific. The aged men, the aged women, the young women, the young men, and the servants. Here's how you ought to live. And he says in Titus chapter 2 and verse 12, denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. And there's something else the church needs. And this is emphasized in the book of Titus. And that is good works. Titus chapter 2 and verse 7. In all things showing thyself a pattern of good works. Titus chapter 2 and verse 14. Zealous of good works. Titus chapter 3 and verse 1. Be ready unto every good work. Titus chapter 3 and verse 8. Be careful to maintain good works. Titus 3 and verse 14. Learn to maintain good works. Here's 3 things the church needs. It needs order. And on the island of Crete, that means you need to have elders to establish this order. And it needs good, healthy teaching, sound doctrine that is conducive and then healthy living that is becoming to that healthy doctrine. And you need to be full of good works, zealous of good works. 3 things that we learn from this letter that Paul wrote after leaving Titus in Crete that every church needs. And that's what we need at Rockcliffe too, isn't it? Order, healthy teachings, and be busy and zealous about doing things that are good. But let's don't get the wrong impression about good works. We read in Titus chapter 3, verses 4 through 7, about our salvation. And salvation is attributed to the kindness and the love and the mercy and the grace of God. But look what we read here. It's not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us. Now learn to maintain good works and be zealous of good works and be busy about doing good works. But those good works you're doing, you're not going to earn your salvation that way. Not by works of righteousness that we've done as he saved us. It's his kindness, his love, his mercy, his grace, his tenderness, that whereby we're going to be saved. But notice also this, not by works, but by the washing of regeneration. You know, some people read that we're not saved by works. And when they read that, they think they're reading this. They say, we're not saved by obedience. Well, that's not what he's saying when he says it's not by works of righteousness. We are to obey. It's by obeying that we receive that gift of his grace and of his mercy. We cannot earn our salvation by doing good works, but we can obey the gospel. The washing of regeneration is the baptism that takes place at the end of the process of regeneration. It's renewing the mind with faith. It's renewing the will with repentance. And then it's renewing the state, going from the state of being a sinner into the state of being a saint when we're baptized. That's the washing of regeneration. And so what does Paul say about this? Here's the doctrine that Paul preached, not by works, but by the washing of regeneration. Not by works, but by baptism. That's the ancient gospel Paul preached on the island of Crete. And that's the gospel we're going to preach. You want to be saved? Then obey the Lord. You're not going to earn your salvation by obeying the Lord. In fact, if you do everything he said you're to do, you're still an unprofitable servant. It's a gift of his grace and his mercy and his kindness toward us, whereby we'll be saved. But we receive that salvation when we obey the gospel of Christ, not by works, but by baptism. If you need to be baptized tonight, then you have an opportunity to do so. And otherwise, I want to admonish you to learn, like those Cretans, this good doctrine, to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. If you need to respond, you can do so while we stand and sing.